All right, everyone. For the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about different theoretical perspectives on deviance. And you'll remember, as I've said in class so many times, there are 1,000,001 theories and perspectives and hypotheses. And what I'm trying to give you is kind of an overarching perspective. And a part of this course is kind of contrasting theories that kind of talk about social cohesion overall and about how society maintains social cohesion and solidarity and bonds versus theories that argue that society is nothing but struggles and conflicts between groups. And so I'm going to talk to you about a few theories about deviance that are kind of along those lines. And to start with that, I want to talk to you about functionalist theories of deviance. And you'll remember that functionalist theories of deviance come from Emil Durkheim, who spent a large part of his career trying to think about how do societies create social solidarity and social consciousness. How do we develop a sense of bonding to each other, and how do we share a collective consciousness about the same values and beliefs? And so he actually felt as though deviance does create social cohesion, that deviance can be used to help create solidarity in society. And so, for example, his perspective was that if you know who the criminals are, well, then you know who the good ones are. And so he kind of argued that, hey, if you can identify who you think are being the deviant people who are acting against the public faith, it helps you feel more bonded about why and how your group is not behaving in that way. The other thing is that he also argued that deviance results from structural strains in society. And so what he meant by that is that we feel solidarity to our society. We're regulated by the rules of society, and we feel attached to society, integrated into society. But sometimes there might be some sort of structural assault on society that causes people to experience anomie. And anomie is this sense of being disconnected. And so an example might be if there's suddenly a factory closing and a large percentage of working people in a town are thrown out of work. And so they have always felt as though that they're breadwinners caring for their families and important members of the community. But when they lose their job as a breadwinner, that will be such a strain that they might feel kind of deviant. They might feel disconnected from society. And that they might feel encouraged to engage in deviant acts like maybe committing crime or protesting angrily against the government. So that's an example about a functionalist perspective. So basically, this argues that deviance occurs when people's attachment to social bonds are diminished. So the more and more people feel disconnected from the norms and values of society, the more likely they may be to become deviant and then maybe even to become criminal. Symbolic interactionist theory is a perspective that argues that deviance is kind of a learned behavior that can be reinforced through your group membership. And that deviance itself, it's not the thing that you do, it's not the learned behavior, it's the process of being labeled, that behavior is labeled as deviant. That's the problem. So regardless of whether you've actually committed a deviant act or not, if you get labeled as a deviant, it's going to have consequences for you. And that basically symbolic interactionist theory is especially interested in thinking through the groups in society that have the power to assign deviant labels, that they're the ones who are actually sort of creating deviance. And so an example I might give you is people who are part of a drug subculture. So people who, let's say they like marijuana. And so they have ideas about how to plant it, how to hide it if you are planting it, who to buy it from, what kind is the best kind of to buy, what versions of marijuana are really good. What's the best way to take it? Do you want to eat it? Do you want it as an edible? Do you want to smoke it? If you smoke it, do you want it as a joint? Do you want it in a bong? The rules they have about what kind of bongs and what things can be used to make bongs. So they have like a lot of different rules and norms and values about how just a simple act of enjoying marijuana can be played out, right? And so you might be in a group that teaches you how to make a bong or teaches you how to hide your bong, teaches you how to engage in smoking without being caught. And so you're part of a deviant subculture, right? And so maybe you don't think it's deviant. Maybe you're doing all of this in Colorado. In Colorado, it's entirely acceptable to legally own marijuana. And so they look at you and think that you're just part of a subculture. But maybe you're in a different state where possession of marijuana is illegal. And so therefore, you might become labeled as deviant, as a drug taker, right? And so it's very interesting to kind of think about that, like think through who's defining the activity, how you learn to engage in activity, how even activities themselves that are considered deviant have rules of membership and cultural norms attached to them. But the part that I think is especially interesting is this idea about labeling. And so labeling theory specifically says that the responses of others are most significant factor in how deviant behavior is created and sustained, and that the power to label an act or a person as deviant results in real social consequences. And that getting rid of a deviant label is really hard. It's very difficult to do. The society, once they label you as deviant, they usually don't. It's just like you're spoiled goods. You are damaged goods, right? And so a person may become deviant because of the label itself, even if she or he didn't engage in deviant behavior. So let me give you a couple examples. Let's say you're living in a small rural town, and you are somebody who's 18 years old, and you decide to engage in premarital sex. So you've engaged in premarital sex. Maybe someone finds out and they want to label you and they want to shame you for it. And so if you're a woman, maybe you're called a slut for how you've engaged in your behavior. So that would be an example of a behavior that some people don't think of as deviant, but this person's gotten the label now, and she might find it very difficult in her hometown to be able to kind of get rid of that label, to have people think of her as somebody else who's not promiscuous, that's just engaging in activity that's kind of widely done by others. So that might be an example. Okay, so when you think specifically about labeling theory, there's three parts of it. So there's primary deviance, the actual violation of a norm or a law. So having possession of marijuana, or driving above the speed limit, or streaking across campus naked. So there's actual violation, right? And then there's secondary deviance, and secondary deviance is behavior that results from being labeled a deviant, and regardless of whether you've actually engaged in the deviance or not. And so if someone spread a rumor about you and said that you were a druggie, or spread a rumor around you and said you were promiscuous. So even if you hadn't engaged in the behavior, you might end up having secondary deviance. People start treating you differently, or punishing you, or acting as though you are somebody of substandard kind of quality. That would be secondary deviance. Tertiary deviance is really interesting sociologically, because that is when a deviant person fully accepts the deviant role but rejects the stigma attached to it. So you remember that I talked to you about stigma being kind of a sense of shame or tarnish because society is looking at you negatively, and that depending on what deviant act you commit, that maybe your stigma becomes a master status, right? So in this case, in tertiary deviance, somebody who's decided that no, they don't feel at all stigmatized about it all. And so you might see this in the examples of somebody like who's a Mexican drug lord, right? They're clearly violating the laws of their nation, laws of several other nations. They're engaging in violence. They're committing murderous acts. They're distributing drugs illegally, and they don't think of that as particularly deviant, or they don't feel stigmatized by it, right? That they're flouting the norms of society. So that might be an example, a pretty extreme example of tertiary deviance. So then the last thing I want to talk to you about is conflict theories of deviance. And so conflict theories, you remember I said, I'm giving you Emil Durkheim's perspective about how society has created social cohesion, solidarity. And then there's Marx, and Karl Marx represents a brand of theories or groupings of theories that are basically conflict theories. And conflict theories are really interested in how groups in society struggle over valuable resources or valuable values, struggle and compete with each other. And so Marx, he was interested in the struggle between the working class and the capitalist bourgeois class, but there are other conflict theories that might look at racial inequality and how it is that whites fare better in judicial system when they commit a drug crime as compared to blacks. So conflict theories basically are just looking at how groups struggle. And so this theoretical perspective argues that dominant classes control the definition of and sanctions attached to deviance. You probably have seen this kind of in reference to marijuana, maybe, discussions about how in the past it seems as though even though whites and blacks both use marijuana, blacks are more likely to be in jail or given longer jail sentences for it. And that now that states are moving towards making it a recreational drug without drug penalty, it's whites who are more likely to be given licenses to open up dispensaries. And so that's an example about dominant classes controlling definition and sanctions of deviance. And so basically, conflict theories argues that deviance results from inequalities in society, including those around class, race, and gender. And that the theory argues that elite deviance goes largely unrecognized and unpunished. So, for example, white-collar crime receiving less punishment than if somebody steals, shoplifts from a grocery store. The FBI, when we'll talk about crime next week, but the FBI has something called the Uniform Crime Reports, where they measure crime in the United States. And the crimes that they measure are those that are predominantly committed by working class and poor people, and not by elite white upper class people. So that would be an example of conflict theory saying, hey, there's an inequality going on. The last thing I want to talk to you about is stigma. And so when we're thinking about deviance, and social control of population and how to manage formal and informal and positive and negative sanctions, we're kind of talking about stigma. And so basically a stigma is an attribute that is socially devalued and discredited, and that people who have a stigma are treated as deviant. So an example is disability might be considered as a stigma. So if you met Stephen Hawking, who's now passed away, he's a brilliant scientist who's revolutionized our thinking about the workings of the universe and our place within it. But he's somebody who had real severe physical limitations, and he was kind of confined to a wheelchair that was designed for his needs for mobility and communication. If you saw him, that might be the first thing you see. That might be the only thing you see. And so that might be his master status. And that might be a stigmatized one. We might have prejudicial views about it. And so sociologists like to study this notion of spoiled identity, that if you're in a stigmatized group, do you feel like your sense of self, your sense of well-being, your future possibilities are ruined? So if you get a negative label, like you've committed a crime, or you're a bad person, or you got expelled from school, do you feel like your sense of identity has been damaged? And then there are those who engage in chosen stigmas. So sociologists obviously love to study that. People who are involved very heavily in maybe in a drug use culture, or selling arms illegally, or they routinely are speeding above the speed limit. That a behavior that they know is a deviant or illegal behavior that they do routinely as part of their life, either as a cultural practice or just in violation of the rules. And so that's a chosen stigma, and what is the meaning that people make of it. So that's all we have to say about kind of deviance and stigma and different perspectives on it. Next week, I'm going to talk to you about crime, like look at the state of crime in the United States, and especially kind of think about the era of mass incarceration, how the United States is really kind of dramatically different than other nations, and how we manage our jail and prison populations.